Master Sergeant Derek Voss grabbed the Barrett .50 by its barrel and shoved it aside like a piece of junk, laughing loud enough for the whole platoon to hear that Sergeant Emily Carter had no business touching a weapon that size. She didn't even flinch. Seconds later, General Michael Reynolds walked straight past her rifle, past her silence without a single glance, as if she wasn't standing there at all. Nobody in that formation had any idea they had just humiliated the most dangerous sniper the United States Army had ever buried and forgotten. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end, because trust me, you do not want to miss where this goes. And while you're at it, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from tonight so I can see just how far this story has traveled. The desert wind at Fort Raven Ridge did not care about rank. It moved the same way over generals as it did over privates, over concrete, as it did over sand. And that morning it moved straight across the eastern berm where Sergeant Emily Carter sat with her Barrett M82, alone the way she always was. Nobody sat with her. Nobody asked to. She had grown used to it. 27 years old, 5 years in this uniform that fit her like it had been made for someone else, and still, every single day, she was the soldier other people looked past on their way to somewhere more interesting. Carter. The voice belonged to Master Sergeant Derek Voss, and it always carried the same tone, half command, half insult, like he couldn't be bothered to separate the two. Emily didn't look up right away. She was running her fingers along the receiver of her rifle, checking for grit. The desert always tried to sneak into the metal. I said, Carter. I heard you the first time, Sergeant. She said, calm, flat, the same voice she used for everything. Voss walked over, boots crunching gravel, and stood over her with his arms crossed. Behind him, two younger soldiers slowed down to watch, sensing the show that was about to start. You know the general's doing a full inspection today, Voss said. Vehicles, weapons, personnel, everything gets looked at. I'm aware. Then get that thing cleaned up right, because right now it looks like somebody's grandmother is holding a bazooka. The two younger soldiers laughed. Emily kept her eyes on the rifle. It's clean, Sergeant. It's clean, Voss repeated, mocking her tone. You know what's not clean? The idea of you being anywhere near a 50 cal during a live evaluation. That's a precision weapon, Carter. That's not a toy you get handed because somebody felt sorry for you. Something tightened in Emily's jaw, just barely, just enough that if you weren't watching closely, you'd miss it completely. She was watching closely, she always was, but she said nothing. Voss reached down and grabbed the barrel of the Barrett, shoving it a few inches sideways like it was a broom leaning against the wrong wall. Sit up straight when the general comes through, he said. Try to look like you belong here. He walked off laughing, the two soldiers trailing behind him, and Emily sat there for a long moment with her hand resting on the cold metal of her rifle, breathing slow, the way she'd trained herself to breathe when something wanted to come out and she wouldn't let it. A voice came from behind her, quieter, careful. You okay, Sergeant? She turned. It was Private First Class Marcus Sanchez, 22 years old, still had that look in his eyes like the Army hadn't finished deciding what kind of soldier it wanted to make him into. I'm fine, Sanchez. He does that to everybody you know. Voss, he's not just, I know what he does. Sanchez hesitated, shifting his weight from one boot to the other. It's just I've seen you shoot. During the range qualifications last month, you put 5 rounds through a target the size of a dinner plate from 600 meters in wind that had everybody else missing high and left. I don't get why nobody talks about that. Emily allowed herself the smallest edge of a smile gone almost before it arrived. Some things aren't meant to be talked about, she said. That's a weird answer. It's the only one I've got. Sanchez opened his mouth like he wanted to push further, then thought better of it and simply nodded the way young soldiers learn to nod at things they don't understand yet, but respect anyway. Word moved through Fort Raven Ridge the way it always did before an inspection. Fast, nervous, everybody suddenly remembering tasks they'd been putting off for weeks. Motor pool sergeants were barking at mechanics to get the grease off the floor. Supply clerks were straightening shelves that hadn't been straight since the base was built. And Voss was practically glowing, walking the perimeter like he already owned it, making sure every soldier under his informal influence understood exactly how today needed to go. This is a big deal, he told a cluster of soldiers near the arms room. General Reynolds doesn't do inspections for fun. He's looking for people who represent what this base is supposed to be. Discipline, precision, strength. His eyes drifted just for a second toward the eastern berm, toward the small figure sitting alone with a rifle too big for the story people had built around her. "Not everybody fits that picture," he added just loud enough. Somebody snickered. Emily heard it. She was too far away to hear the words clearly, but she didn't need to. She'd heard some version of that sentence 100 times in 5 years, and she'd learned that the best response wasn't a response at all. It was patience. Patience was the only weapon that never jammed. By mid-morning, the convoy carrying General Michael Reynolds rolled through the main gate. 3 vehicles, flags snapping in the desert wind, dust rising behind them like the base itself was announcing his arrival. Reynolds stepped out of the lead vehicle, the way men who'd spent 30 years in uniform always did, unhurried, certain like the ground itself had been waiting for him to walk on it. He was 61 years old, broad-shouldered even now, with the kind of face that had stopped smiling for photographs decades ago because there had simply been too many funerals in between. The base commander, Colonel Whitfield, met him at the gate with a salute sharp enough to cut glass. "General, welcome to Raven Ridge." "Colonel." Reynolds returned the salute, eyes already scanning the base like he was cataloging every flaw before anyone had a chance to hide it. "Let's get started." They moved through the motor pool first. Reynolds ran a hand along the hood of a Humvee, checked the tire pressure gauges without being asked a mechanic. 3 sharp questions about maintenance logs that made the young soldier's hands shake as he answered. "Good," Reynolds said finally, and the mechanic exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for an hour. They moved to the arms room next. Voss was there standing at perfect attention, and when Reynolds walked the line of weapons racks, Voss stepped forward smoothly. "Master Sergeant Derek Voss, sir. I oversee weapons maintenance and marksmanship training for this unit." "Your rifles are clean," Reynolds said, glancing over the racks. "Thank you, sir. We hold ourselves to a high standard here." "Good." It was a small exchange, barely 30 seconds, but Voss stood a little taller after it, like he'd been handed something precious. The inspection continued. Communications tent, supply depot, medical station. Every stop, Reynolds asked pointed questions. Every stop, soldiers straightened their spines a little more, hoping today would be the day the general remembered their name. And then the group turned toward the perimeter positions toward the eastern berm, toward the place where Emily Carter sat with her Barrett M82, exactly where she always sat. Sanchez, walking a few paces back in the formation, trailing the general's group, felt his stomach tighten. He glanced toward Emily and saw her sit up slightly straighter, adjusting nothing about her expression, her hands steady on the rifle resting across her knees. Voss saw it too, and something like satisfaction moved across his face. Reynolds approached the perimeter positions one by one. He stopped at the first sniper post, spoke briefly with the soldier. They nodded, moved on. He stopped at the second post, asked about the weapon 0. Listened to the answer, nodded, moved on. Then he reached Emily. For half a second, less than half a second, his eyes passed over her the way they'd passed over the ground beneath his boots, the fence line behind her, the horizon past the wire. Registered, categorized, dismissed. "Sergeant," he said, not even a full sentence, barely an acknowledgement, and he kept walking. He didn't stop. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask about her weapon, her training, her record, anything. He simply walked past her the way you'd walk past a rock, a fence post, a piece of equipment that had already been accounted for and required no further attention. Behind him, Voss's smile widened just slightly, just enough for the soldiers near him to catch it and understand exactly what it meant. Sanchez felt something hot rise in his chest, an anger he didn't fully understand yet. Watching Emily sit perfectly still as the man with the most authority on this entire base looked straight through her like she was made of glass. Emily didn't move. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. But something in her eyes did, something old. Something that had been buried for a very long time, flickering there for just a moment before she closed it back down, the way she'd learned to close down everything that threatened to surface at the wrong time. Voss couldn't resist. As the inspection group moved past, he lingered just long enough to lean down toward her. "See?" he murmured, quiet enough that only she could hear it. "Told you. You're furniture out here, Carter. Might as well be a rock with a rifle." He straightened up and jogged a few steps to catch back up with the group, satisfied, victorious, like he'd just won something that mattered. Emily sat there in the silence he left behind, and for the first time all morning, her jaw tightened in a way that wasn't invisible anymore. in a way that Sanchez, still standing a few yards back, absolutely saw. He waited until the inspection group moved fully out of earshot before he walked over and crouched beside her. "Oh, that was messed up," he said. "What he just did. What the general just did." "It's fine, Sanchez." "It's not fine. You put in more range hours than half this base combined. You've got a marksmanship score that nobody's touched since I got here. And he just walked past you like you're a fence post." Emily looked out at the desert, at the heat shimmering off the sand in waves that made the horizon look like it was breathing. "People see what they expect to see," she said quietly. "Rank doesn't change that. Neither does a general's star." He saw a quiet woman sitting next to a rifle too big for her, and that's exactly what he was looking for, so that's exactly what he found. "That's messed up," Sanchez said again, quieter this time, like the anger had nowhere left to go. "Maybe," Emily said. "Or maybe it doesn't matter what he saw today." Sanchez frowned. "What do you mean?" Emily didn't answer right away. She reached down and adjusted the sling on her rifle, an old habit, a small motion that gave her hands something to do while her mind went somewhere else, somewhere Sanchez couldn't follow. "Some soldiers get remembered for what people see," she said finally. "Others get remembered for what people needed right when they needed it most." I stopped caring which one I was a long time ago. There was a weight in the way she said it, a weight that made Sanchez feel like he'd just brushed up against something much bigger than a bruised ego, something with edges he couldn't see the shape of yet. "You're talking like you've done something before," he said carefully. "Something big." Emily's eyes flicked to him just for a second, and there it was again. That flicker, that flash of something buried deep enough that most people would never notice it existed at all. "Everybody's done something before, Sanchez," she said. "The Army just decides which stories get told and which ones get sealed in a drawer somewhere." "Sealed? Forget I said that." "Sergeant." "Sanchez." Her voice was gentle but final, the kind of final that told him this particular door was closing and wasn't going to open again today. "Don't worry about the general. Don't worry about Voss. Just do your job and let people underestimate you. It's the safest place to stand." He wanted to ask more. He wanted to ask what safest meant. Safest from what? Why a 27-year-old support sniper talked like someone who'd survived something the rest of them couldn't imagine. But the look on her face told him this conversation had reached its edge, so he simply nodded and sat down beside her, not saying anything else, just being there, which was its own kind of answer. They sat together in the silence for almost 20 minutes. The desert wind moving past them, the sound of the inspection continuing somewhere behind them, muffled and distant. Emily's mind, though, wasn't on the wind or the silence. It was somewhere else entirely. It was 3 years back, in a place she never spoke about, in a moment that had changed the entire shape of her career, without anyone outside a locked file ever knowing why. She remembered a radio crackling with panic. She remembered a decision that had to be made in under 4 seconds. She remembered the sound a rifle makes when everything is riding on a single shot, and the silence afterward that was heavier than any silence she'd ever known before or since. She remembered the moment she realized that saving lives and protecting careers were not the same thing, and that choosing one over the other would cost her almost everything she'd built. She remembered the day they told her word for word, cold procedural, like reading off a grocery list, that her operational status was being reclassified, that certain records were being sealed, that certain achievements would no longer appear on any official document anyone could access. She remembered asking why. She remembered the answer. Because you know too much, and knowing too much makes people nervous, and nervous people make decisions that have nothing to do with what's right. She'd carried that memory for 3 years, folded up small, tucked into a place where it couldn't interfere with the job in front of her. And every time someone like Voss called her furniture, every time a general walked past her without a glance, that folded memory pressed a little harder against the inside of her chest, reminding her it was still there, still waiting, still true. "Sergeant," Sanchez's voice pulled her by him. "You went somewhere just now." "Just thinking," she said. "About what?" Emily looked at him at the honest concern on his face, the kind of concern that hadn't been trained out of him yet by 5 more years in this uniform. "About patience," she said, "and how sometimes it's the only thing standing between who people think you are and who you actually are." Before Sanchez could respond, the base alarm system cracked to life, a harsh electronic tone that cut through the desert air and sent every soldier within earshot straight to their feet. Emily was up instantly, rifle in hand, every trace of stillness gone from her body, replaced by something sharp and immediate. "That's not a drill," she said. "How do you know?" "Because drills don't sound like that." Across the base, soldiers were sprinting toward the command center, boots slapping against packed dirt, radios crackling with overlapping voices, trying to get information faster than the system could deliver it. Colonel Whitfield was already moving at a near run toward the operations building. General Reynolds a half step behind him, his earlier calm completely gone, replaced by the focused urgency of a man who'd spent 30 years learning what real emergencies sounded like. Inside the command center, the tactical display lit up with a red marker roughly 4 kilometers out from the base perimeter, deep in the open desert. "Talk to me," Reynolds said, striding into the room. The intelligence officer, Captain Alvarez, was already pulling data onto the main screen, her voice tight with urgency. "Sir, we've got a confirmed high-value target connected to the Meridian weapons network we've been tracking for the past 6 months. Satellite and drone confirmation both place him at this location right now, moving with an armed convoy, 3 vehicles, estimated 8 to 10 hostiles." 4 kilometers, Reynolds said, staring at the screen. "That's outside effective engagement range for standard infantry weapons." "Yes, sir, which is why we need a precision option, and we need it in the next 10 minutes. The target's convoy is mobile. Our intelligence indicates they're moving toward a rendezvous point where we lose all visibility and all opportunity." 10 minutes, Whitfield repeated. 10 minutes, sir. After that, this window closes, and it may not open again for months. Reynolds turned toward the door. "Get me every long-range shooter on this base. Now." Within minutes, the base's senior marksmen were gathered at the eastern observation platform, Voss among them, spotting scopes and rangefinders already out, calculations already scrawled across notepads with shaking hands. The heat that day was brutal, waves of it rippling up off the sand, distorting the horizon, and the wind wasn't cooperating either, gusting unpredictably from multiple directions as it funneled through the terrain features between the base and the target. "Wind's all over the place," one sniper said, adjusting his scope. "I'm reading 12 miles an hour from the northeast, but it's gusting to 20, and I think there's a secondary current coming off that ridgeline, messing with everything downrange." "Mirage is bad too," another added. "I can barely hold a stable picture on the target vehicle. It's swimming." Voss knelt behind his own rifle, running the numbers, muttering under his breath, adjusting his scope with hands that weren't quite as steady as he wanted them to be. 4,000 meters, he said. "That's pushing past what most of us have ever attempted in these conditions." "Can anyone make this shot?" Reynolds asked, standing behind the platform, his voice carrying the weight of a man who understood exactly what was riding on the answer. Silence. "Somebody give me an answer," Reynolds said, sharper now. One of the senior snipers, a staff sergeant named Delgado, shook his head slowly. "Sir, with respect, at this range and this wind, with this mirage, I wouldn't put confidence above 30% on a first-round hit. Maybe lower. And we don't get a second shot before that convoy hits the rendezvous point." 30%, Reynolds repeated. "That might be generous, sir." Voss straightened up from his rifle jaw, tight his earlier confidence, visibly cracking under the pressure of an audience that included the general himself. "I can attempt it," he said. "Attempt isn't good enough, Master Sergeant," Reynolds said. "I need someone who can make this shot, not someone willing to try." The command center radio crackled with an update from the surveillance drone. "Target convoy picking up speed, estimated 6 minutes to rendezvous point." 6 minutes, Whitfield said. "General, we're running out of runway here." Reynolds stood at the edge of the platform, staring out at the shimmering horizon where, somewhere invisible to the naked eye, a man responsible for arming networks that had already cost American lives was moving further and further out of reach with every passing second. "Somebody make this shot," he said, quieter now, almost to himself. "Somebody make this shot." Voss knelt back down behind his rifle, sweat beading along his hairline, despite the dry heat, adjusting his scope with the kind of desperate focus of a man trying to will confidence into existence through sheer force of effort. "I've got the shot," he said, voice unsteady. "I've got it." He made his calculations, adjusted for wind, adjusted for distance, adjusted for the mirage distorting his sight picture, and after nearly 90 seconds of silence on the platform, he squeezed the trigger. The round went wide, kicking up a spray of sand nowhere near the target vehicle, and over the radio the drone operator's voice confirmed what everyone on the platform already knew. "Miss, no effect on target. Repeat, target unaffected, still moving." Voss's shoulders sagged. He didn't look up from his scope like looking up would mean facing the humiliation directly instead of just feeling it privately. 5 minutes, Whitfield said, checking his watch. General, we need a decision. There is no decision, Delgado said quietly. Nobody up here can make this shot. Not in these conditions. Reynolds closed his eyes for half a second, the weight of 30 years of command pressing down on him in a way it hadn't in a very long time. Somewhere out there, a man was about to disappear back into a network that would keep killing people until somebody stopped him, and every trained shooter on this base had just told him in one form or another that it couldn't be done. Then the radio in the command center crackled to life, a different frequency, encrypted a channel that hadn't been active in years, a channel that half the people in that room didn't even know existed. A voice cut through the static calm, precise, controlled, in a way that stood in sharp contrast to the panic surrounding it. Command, this is requesting activation authorization. Call sign Silent Falcon, requesting immediate authorization to engage. Every head in the command center turned toward the radio at once. Whitfield's face went pale. That's not possible. What frequency is that? Reynolds asked sharply. Who authorized access to that channel? The communications officer, a young corporal, looked up with wide eyes, fingers frozen over his console. Sir, I don't know how that transmission is even reaching us. That's a decommissioned frequency. It hasn't shown activity in years, according to the system. Logs, it doesn't even officially exist anymore. Silent Falcon, Delgado said slowly, like the words themselves were dangerous. I haven't heard that name since I was stationed overseas. I thought that call sign was retired. You thought what Reynolds demanded. Delgado hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Sir, there were stories, rumors mostly, about a shooter who took an impossible position years ago and made a shot nobody thought was survivable, let alone successful. Nobody ever confirmed the details. The whole operation got sealed, records buried. I always figured it was exaggeration, campfire talk, the kind of stories soldiers tell each other to make the job sound bigger than it is. And now that name is coming through a channel that shouldn't exist, Reynolds said, requesting authorization to take a shot every trained sniper on this base just told me was impossible. The radio crackled again. Command, please respond. Requesting authorization. Time window is closing. Reynolds looked around the command center at Whitfield's pale face, at Delgado's stunned expression, at Voss standing frozen near his rifle with sand still on his hands from a shot that had failed. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Reynolds turned slowly and looked out through the open doorway of the command center, past the platform where his best shooters had just failed toward the eastern berm, toward the perimeter position he had walked past that very morning without so much as learning the name of the soldier sitting there. Sergeant Emily Carter was standing now, radio handset in her hand, her Barrett M82 already shouldered, her posture completely transformed from the quiet, overlooked figure he had dismissed with barely a glance hours earlier. Carter, Reynolds said quietly, the pieces beginning to assemble in his mind even as he refused to fully believe them. Whitfield followed his gaze and went even paler than before. Sir, that's the support sniper, the one we just walked past this morning. 4 minutes, the communications officer said, voice shaking. Rendezvous window in 4 minutes. Reynolds stared across the base at the woman standing calmly on the berm, radio in hand, the weight of an impossible shot resting entirely on shoulders he had hours earlier judged too small to carry anything of consequence at all. Somebody tell me right now, Reynolds said, his voice low and urgent. Who exactly is Sergeant Emily Carter? Nobody answered because in that moment, nobody on that base actually knew the whole truth. Not Whitfield, not Delgado, not Voss standing frozen with failure, still fresh on his hands, and not even Sanchez watching from a distance with his heart pounding against his ribs. Only Emily knew. And as the radio crackled one final time with the same urgent request cutting through the silence of a base that had suddenly forgotten how to breathe, she raised the handset to her mouth, closed her eyes for just a single second, and answered the only way she knew how. This is Silent Falcon, she said, requesting authorization to engage. Reynolds didn't hesitate. 30 years of command had taught him that hesitation in a moment like this cost lives, and whatever confusion was tearing through his mind about who this woman actually was, he pushed it aside and grabbed the radio from the communications officer's hand. Silent Falcon, this is General Michael Reynolds. Authorization granted. You are cleared to engage. Confirm you copy. Static. 1 second. 2. Copy, General. Falcon is moving to final position. Requesting spotter support priority. Whitfield spun toward the room. Get her a spotter. Now, somebody move. Sanchez didn't wait for an order that specifically named him. He was already sprinting across the compound before Whitfield finished the sentence, boots kicking up dust, heart slamming against his ribs so hard he could feel it in his throat. He'd watched Emily Carter get dismissed all morning. He'd watched a general walk past her like she was invisible. And now he was running toward her at a dead sprint because somehow impossibly, she was the only person left who could stop whatever was happening 4 kilometers out in that shimmering desert heat. He reached the berm, gasping, dropping into position beside her without being asked twice. You called for a spotter, he managed between breaths. Emily didn't look at him. Her eye was already pressed to the scope, her breathing slow and even, despite the chaos erupting behind them. Good, she said. Get on the spotting scope. Left side, now. Sanchez scrambled into position, hands shaking as he adjusted the tripod-mounted spotting scope beside her. Sergeant, I've never spotted for a shot like this. I don't even know if I can. You don't need experience, Emily said, her voice suddenly different than he'd ever heard it, sharper, clearer, carrying an authority that hadn't been there 10 minutes earlier. You need to trust what I tell you and call exactly what you see. Nothing more, nothing less. Can you do that? Sanchez swallowed hard. Yes, Sergeant. Then let's go to work. Back in the command center, Delgado was staring at the radio like it had grown teeth. General, I need to say something. That frequency she used, that channel, doesn't exist in any current system. It was purged 3 years ago. There's no way anyone should be able to transmit on it. But she did, Reynolds said. Yes, sir. Which means either our systems are compromised or that call sign was never actually decommissioned. Whitfield finished. Just hidden. Captain Alvarez looked up from her console, face pale. Sir, I'm trying to pull her personnel file right now for verification, and I'm getting an access restriction I've never seen before. Even your clearance level isn't returning results. It's blank. Redacted. Like it was scrubbed at a level above this base entirely. Reynolds felt something cold settle in his chest. 30 years in the Army, and he had never once encountered a file he couldn't access. Keep trying, he said. I want answers. Yes, sir. On the eastern berm, Emily was running her hand along the rifle stock, feeling the heat of the barrel, the weight of the weapon that had felt like part of her own body for longer than she cared to admit. Talk to me about the wind, she said to Sanchez. He pressed his eye to the spotting scope, scanning the shimmering distance. It's moving everywhere, Sergeant. I can see grass bending near that ridge, maybe 8 miles an hour from the northeast. But closer to us, there's dust kicking sideways like it's coming from the south. 2 wind currents, Emily murmured. One at the muzzle, one downrange. That's the problem everyone else had. How do you account for 2 different winds at the same time? You don't average them, she said, adjusting her scope with slow, deliberate movements. You calculate them separately, apply them at different points along the bullet's flight path. It's not one equation. It's 2. Sanchez blinked. That's not something they teach at basic marksmanship school. No, Emily said quietly. It's something you learn when you don't have a choice but to learn it. 3 minutes remained before the convoy reached its rendezvous point, and every second of it felt like it was stretching thin enough to snap. Target vehicle still moving, the drone operator reported over the radio. Speed increasing. They may have picked up on surveillance activity. They know, Reynolds said, watching the tactical display. They're running. Falcon target speed increasing, Whitfield relayed over the radio. You may lose your window. Emily's voice came back steady, unshaken. Copy, adjusting for target movement. Sanchez, give me a range check. Sanchez fumbled with the laser range finder mounted beside the spotting scope, hands still trembling. Range it's reading 3,940 meters. Sergeant, that's almost 4 kilometers. I know how far it is, Emily said, not unkindly, just focused, completely and totally focused. Give me elevation and hold data. Sanchez ran the numbers through the ballistic calculator strapped to his wrist, his voice shaking as he called them out. Elevation 42 mils up, windage 14 mils left for the primary current, adjusting for the secondary gust pattern, near the target, maybe another 3 mils. Copy, Emily said, dialing her scope with fingers that moved like they'd done this exact motion 10,000 times before because they had. Back at the command center, Voss had made his way inside, standing near the back of the room, watching the tactical display with an expression nobody could quite read. Shame, maybe. Or something worse, the slow, sick realization that the woman he had humiliated that very morning was the only person on this entire base with any chance of pulling off what he himself had just failed to do. She's not gonna make this shot, he muttered more to himself than anyone else. Nobody makes this shot. Delgado, standing nearby, turned toward him with a look that carried no sympathy at all. You didn't make it either, Voss. Voss's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond because there wasn't anything to say. On the berm, Emily settled into her final position, cheek pressed against the stock, breathing, slowing into the rhythm she'd trained into her body over years, over a career most people would never fully understand, over a version of herself that only existed in classified files nobody could access anymore. And for just a moment, unbidden, the memory surged up. She was somewhere else. Somewhere hot, somewhere loud, somewhere 3 years in the past where a radio had crackled with panic and a young lieutenant's voice had screamed coordinates that didn't match what she was seeing through her scope, and she'd had 4 seconds to decide whether to trust the coordinates or trust her own eyes, and she trusted her eyes, and that decision had saved 11 soldiers and ended her career in the same breath. Sergeant, Sanchez's voice cut through the memory, pulling her back. 90 seconds to rendezvous point. You're running out of time. Emily blinked, forcing the memory back into the box she kept it in, forcing her focus back onto the shimmering horizon in front of her. Copy, she said. Wind check final. Sanchez scanned again, voice tight with urgency. Primary wind holding steady northeast 10 miles an hour. Secondary current near target. That's the tricky one. It's gusting, Sergeant. I'm seeing spikes up to 18, then dropping to 6, then back up. It's not consistent. Give me the pattern, not the numbers, Emily said. Sanchez frowned, confused for a half second, then understood what she meant, watching the dust and grass movement instead of trying to force numbers onto something that refused to hold still. It's cycling, he said. Every 4 seconds, roughly. Spike, drop, spike, drop. Good, Emily said. That's what I needed. 60 seconds to rendezvous. Target still moving? The drone operator's voice crackled over the shared radio channel. If they reach that tree line, we'd lose visual entirely. 45 seconds, Whitfield called out from the command center. Reynolds stood watching the tactical display, hands clenched at his sides, 30 years of command experience, screaming at him that this shot was impossible, and some other instinct, older, quieter, telling him to trust the woman he'd walked past that morning without a second glance. Come on, he whispered so quiet nobody around him heard it. Come on. On the berm, Emily's finger rested against the trigger guard, not yet on the trigger itself, waiting, watching, counting the cycles. Sanchez had identified 4 seconds. Spike drop, 4 seconds. Spike drop. 30 seconds, Sanchez said, voice barely above a whisper now, like raising it any louder might shake her concentration loose. Emily didn't respond. Her entire world had narrowed down to the reticle in her scope, the shimmering target 4 kilometers away, the rhythm of wind she'd locked into her mind like a second heartbeat. 20 seconds. Her finger moved from the guard to the trigger, resting there, not pressing, just resting, waiting for the exact moment in the marco when everything would align. 15 seconds. Somewhere behind her at the command center, Voss found himself holding his breath without realizing it, watching a tactical screen that couldn't show him what was happening on that berm, but somehow feeling the weight of it anyway. 10 seconds. Emily exhaled slow, controlled, the way she'd trained herself to do 1,000 times before in a career most of this base had no idea she'd ever had. 5 seconds. The wind spiked, then began to drop right on the 4-second cycle Sanchez had called. And in that narrow window between the spike and the next one, Emily Carter squeezed the trigger. The Barrett M82 fired with a crack that rolled across the desert like thunder. The recoil driving back into her shoulder with the same familiar violence it always had, and for 2.5 seconds, an eternity compressed into a heartbeat. Nobody on that base knew whether the shot had found its mark or vanished uselessly into 4 kilometers of shifting air. Splash, Sanchez breathed, watching through the spotting scope, his voice barely audible. Splash, splash, come on, come on. The drone feed crackled to life over the command center speakers, the operator's voice climbing with disbelief. Confirmed hit. Confirmed hit. Target down. Repeat, target is down. The command center exploded into stunned, disbelieving silence, the kind of silence that comes right before people remember how to breathe again. Say that again, Whitfield said like he hadn't heard it correctly. Target neutralized, sir, the drone operator repeated, voice shaking with something between shock and awe. One shot, direct hit at just under 4,000 meters. I have never seen anything like that in my life. Reynolds stood frozen, staring at the tactical display at the small red marker that had just gone dark, representing a man who 30 seconds earlier had been getting away and who was now permanently removed from a network that had been killing people for months. She hit it, he said quietly. She actually hit it. Delgado let out a breath he'd been holding for what felt like a full minute. 4,000 meters in that wind, with that mirage. That's not a shot, General. That's not something you train for. That's something you were born with, and even that's not usually enough. Voss said nothing at all. He simply stood there staring at the tactical display, feeling something crack open inside him that he wasn't ready to look at directly yet. On the berm, Sanchez turned toward Emily with wide, disbelieving eyes, his hands still shaking around the spotting scope. You did it, he said. Sergeant, you actually did it. That's not possible. That was not possible. Emily lowered the rifle slowly, her own hands steady. Even now, even after a shot that would have made most trained marksmen's hands shake uncontrollably from adrenaline alone. It was possible, she said quietly. It was just difficult. Difficult, Sanchez repeated, half laughing, half stunned. Sergeant, I don't think that word means what you think it means. For the first time all day, something that almost looked like a real smile touched the corner of Emily's mouth. Small, brief, but genuine. Get some rest, Sanchez, she said. You did good work today. Me, you're the one who just made a shot nobody else on this entire base could even attempt. Before Emily could respond, the sound of running footsteps reached them. Multiple sets boots pounding against packed earth, and she turned to see General Reynolds himself crossing the compound at a pace that no 61-year-old man should have been able to sustain, Whitfield and Delgado trailing behind him, unable to keep up. Reynolds stopped a few feet from her, breathing hard, staring at her, with an expression that had completely replaced the dismissive glance he'd given her that morning. An expression made entirely of confusion, disbelief, and something that looked uncomfortably close to shame. For a long moment, he didn't say anything at all. General, Emily said, finally coming to attention out of habit, the rifle still cradled in her arms. At ease, Sergeant, Reynolds said, his voice rougher than usual. At ease. She relaxed, but only slightly, watching him with the same careful patience she'd shown Voss that morning, the same patience that had let 100 insults roll off her without leaving a mark. That shot, Reynolds said slowly, should not have been possible. My best shooters told me it couldn't be done. One of them attempted it and missed by a significant margin. And you just made it look almost effortless. It wasn't effortless, sir, Emily said quietly. It just didn't need to look difficult. Reynolds studied her for a long moment, and Emily could see the exact instant the question formed behind his eyes, the same question that was clearly burning through everyone else standing on that compound. Silent Falcon, he said slowly, testing the words like they might dissolve if he said them wrong. That call sign came through on a channel my own communications officer says shouldn't exist. Captain Alvarez tried to pull your personnel file for verification and got a redaction she's never seen before above my own clearance level. So I'm going to ask you directly, Sergeant Carter, and I would appreciate the truth. Who exactly are you? The compound had gone quiet around them. Soldiers gathering at a respectful distance, drawn by the strange gravity of the moment, watching the general who had walked past this woman without a second glance that very morning, now standing in front of her, asking a question he clearly didn't know how to prepare for. Emily looked at him for a long moment, and something passed behind her eyes, weighing, calculating the same careful patience she used for everything, except this time it looked heavier, like she was deciding whether 3 years of silence were finally actually going to end. Sir, she said slowly, that's a longer conversation than we probably have time for right now. Make time, Reynolds said, not unkindly but firm, in a way that left no room for deflection. Because I just watched a woman I dismissed as unremarkable this morning make a shot that 4 of my best trained snipers said was impossible. I think I've earned an explanation. Before Emily could answer, the radio clipped to Sanchez's belt crackled unexpectedly, the same encrypted frequency that had carried her authorization request minutes earlier, the frequency that officially did not exist. Everyone on the compound froze. A voice came through male, unfamiliar calm in a way that felt almost clinical, carrying none of the panic or urgency that had defined every other transmission that morning. Confirmed successful engagement. Well done, Falcon. It's been a long time. Emily's entire body went rigid, the color draining slightly from her face, her eyes locking onto the radio, like it had just spoken a language only she fully understood. "Who is that?" Reynolds demanded, spinning toward Whitfield. "Get me a trace on that transmission immediately." "Sir, I'm trying." The communications officer's voice crackled back from inside the command center, tight with confusion. "But this frequency isn't routing through any system we control. I can't trace it. I don't even know how it's reaching us." The voice on the radio continued, unhurried, deliberate. "Sergeant Carter, you should know your activation today wasn't random. There's more coming, and this time you won't be able to walk away from it quietly." The transmission cut off, replaced by dead static, and the entire compound stood frozen in a silence so complete that Sanchez could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Emily stared at the radio for a long moment, her jaw tight, her eyes distant, somewhere far away from the dusty compound and the stunned soldiers surrounding her. "Sergeant," Reynolds said slowly, his voice carrying a new edge, something between authority and genuine unease. "Who was that?" Emily turned to look at him, and for the first time since he'd known her, which admittedly was only a matter of hours, Reynolds saw something in her expression that looked almost like fear, quickly buried, quickly controlled, but unmistakably there for just a fraction of a second. "Sir," she said quietly, "I think we need to talk somewhere private, right now." Whitfield stepped forward, glancing nervously between Emily and the general. "General, with respect, what just happened here? That transmission, that voice, it sounded like it knew her. It sounded like it knew this was going to happen before it happened." "I don't know," Reynolds admitted, and for a man who had spent 30 years projecting absolute certainty in front of his troops, the admission cost him visibly. "But I intend to find out." He turned back to Emily, and this time there was no dismissiveness left in his eyes at all, only a hard-focused attention that hadn't been there that morning. "My office," he said, "now. And Sergeant, I want the truth, all of it." Emily nodded slowly, shouldering her rifle, her expression settling back into the careful stillness that had carried her through 5 years of being overlooked, 5 years of quiet patience, while she waited apparently for a moment exactly like this one. As they walked together toward the command building, Sanchez stood frozen on the berm, staring at the radio in his hand, replaying the stranger's voice over and over in his mind. "There's more coming, and this time you won't be able to walk away from it quietly." Behind him, Voss had finally found his voice again, though it came out smaller than anyone had ever heard it before. "What in the hell did we just witness?" he muttered, not really asking anyone, just needing to say it out loud. Nobody answered him. Inside the command building, Reynolds closed the office door behind them, shutting out the noise of a base still buzzing with disbelief, and turned to face Emily Carter with the full weight of his attention finally completely focused on her. "Start talking," he said, "and don't leave anything out." Emily set her rifle down carefully against the wall the way she always did, precise, deliberate, buying herself a few extra seconds before the words she'd been holding back for 3 years finally had to leave her mouth. "3 years ago," she began, her voice steady but quiet, "I was assigned to a joint operation overseas, classified beyond anything most people on this base have ever touched. My unit was tracking a weapons network, the same kind of network that Convoy out there was connected to today. Same organization, different cell." Reynolds' expression sharpened. "The same network." "Yes, sir, which is why that voice on the radio said what it said. This wasn't a coincidence. Somebody wanted me activated today. Somebody's been watching, waiting for the right moment to pull Silent Falcon back into the field, and they used a threat they knew this base couldn't handle without me to make it happen." "You're saying today's operation was engineered," Reynolds said slowly, "to force your hand?" Emily nodded once. "I believe so, sir. And I believe whoever is responsible for that is going to want something from me now that I've answered the call. Something I'm not entirely sure this base is prepared for." Outside the office window, the desert sun beat down on Fort Raven Ridge, exactly the way it had that morning, exactly the way it always had, except now the entire base had shifted underneath everyone's feet, and nobody standing on that dusty ground had any idea just how far this was about to go, or how much of Emily Carter's buried past was about to come crawling back out into the light, whether she was ready for it or not. The office fell quiet after Emily's words settled between them, and Reynolds sat down slowly behind his desk, the chair creaking under the weight of a man who suddenly felt every one of his 61 years pressing down on his shoulders at once. Engineered, he repeated. You're telling me somebody deliberately created a crisis on my base just to pull you back out into the open? Yes, sir. That's a significant claim, Sergeant. I understand that, sir. I also understand it's the only explanation that makes sense. That frequency doesn't exist anymore. It was purged from every active system 3 years ago when my status changed. Nobody should have been able to reach me on it, which means somebody kept that channel alive somewhere waiting for the right moment. Reynolds leaned forward, and elbows on the desk, studying her the way he might study a map with half the terrain missing. Then let's talk about 3 years ago, he said. All of it. Start from the beginning. Emily's hands folded in her lap, still controlled, but her eyes had gone somewhere distant. Somewhere Reynolds couldn't follow, even though he was staring right at her. I was part of a joint task force, she said. 6 operators, myself included, tracking a weapons cell that was moving hardware through a corridor nobody was supposed to know existed. We'd been on the ground for 11 days. Everything was going according to plan until it wasn't. What happened? We got ambushed at a checkpoint that wasn't supposed to have any resistance. Intelligence said it was clear. It wasn't clear. It was a trap, and it was waiting for us specifically, which meant somebody had told them exactly where we'd be and exactly when. Reynolds' jaw tightened. A leak. A leak, Emily confirmed. My unit got pinned down in a position with no cover taking fire from 3 directions. Command back at base wanted us to hold and wait for extraction. I had eyes on the situation they didn't have. I could see we didn't have time to wait. So I made a call nobody had authorized me to make. What call? I took a shot at 1,100 meters through a gap in the crossfire that existed for maybe 4 seconds, and it broke the ambush enough for my team to move. 11 soldiers walked out of that valley who wouldn't have otherwise. But taking that shot meant disobeying a direct order to hold position, and it meant exposing in the after-action report exactly how badly that intelligence failure had been. Reynolds sat back slowly. And somebody didn't want that exposed. Somebody didn't want that exposed, Emily said, her voice flattening out, controlled the way it always got when she was holding something back by force of will alone. Because the officer who signed off on that faulty intelligence wasn't some junior analyst who could quietly get reassigned. It was somebody with a career worth protecting. Somebody with connections that went higher than anyone wanted to admit. Who? Emily hesitated, and for the first time since walking into that office, Reynolds saw real conflict cross her face. Not fear exactly, but the particular exhaustion of someone who had carried a name alone for 3 years and wasn't sure what would happen the moment she finally said it out loud. Colonel Harold Briggs, she said finally. At the time, he was running intelligence coordination for the region. Today, sir, he's a 2-star general sitting on a joint operations command that oversees, among other things, budget and personnel decisions for bases like this one. The room went very still. Briggs, Reynolds said slowly, like he was testing whether saying the name out loud might make the ground shift under him. I know that name. Then you understand why my career got buried instead of celebrated, Emily said. Saving 11 lives wasn't the story that mattered. Protecting Briggs was the story that mattered. My records got sealed, my call sign got wiped from active use, and I got quietly reassigned to a support rotation on a remote outpost where nobody would think to ask questions. Reynolds pressed his palms flat against the desk, breathing slow processing information that was rearranging itself in his head faster than he could organize it into something coherent. So if Briggs buried you 3 years ago to protect himself, he said, why would anyone connected to him want you activated today? That doesn't track. That's the opposite of what he'd want. I don't think it was Briggs on that radio, Emily said. I think whoever that was is watching Briggs too. I think there's a piece of this I still don't have. A knock at the door interrupted them, sharp, urgent. Enter, Reynolds called. Whitfield stepped in face tight with a new kind of tension that hadn't been there 10 minutes earlier. General, I think you need to see this immediately. Reynolds stood. What is it? Satellite tracking just flagged movement approximately 30 miles south of our position. Multiple vehicles moving in a pattern that doesn't match civilian traffic. Captain Alvarez thinks it's a retaliatory response to the strike this morning. Emily was on her feet before Whitfield finished the sentence. How many vehicles? 4, maybe 5, Whitfield said. Alvarez is still refining the count. That's fast. Emily said half to herself, her mind already racing through implications Reynolds couldn't yet see. That's too fast for a standard retaliation. Networks like this don't mobilize a response team within an hour of losing a high-value target unless they already had assets staged nearby. Staged for what? Reynolds asked. Emily's eyes met his, and there was something in them now that hadn't been there before, a cold, focused clarity that made the hair on the back of Reynolds' neck stand up. Staged for exactly this, she said, in case their operation ever got compromised. A contingency, which means today wasn't just about killing that target general. Today may have triggered something bigger that's already been sitting in motion for a long time. They moved together toward the command center, Whitfield trailing behind, and by the time they arrived, Alvarez was already pulling updated satellite data onto the main screen, her expression grim. 5 vehicles confirmed, she said. Moving at speed, current trajectory suggests they'll reach a position within visual range of the base inside 90 minutes if they maintain this pace. 90 minutes, Reynolds repeated. Yes, sir. Do we know what we're dealing with? Armament, personnel, count, anything? Alvarez shook her head. Not with certainty. Drone coverage is limited at this range and altitude. But given the connection to this morning's target and given the speed of their response, I'd estimate this isn't a small retaliatory strike. This looks organized. Delgado, standing near the back of the room, spoke up carefully. General, if I may, this base isn't built for a coordinated assault. We're a support outpost. Our defensive capabilities are limited to perimeter security and small arms. If that convoy is bringing anything heavier, we could be real trouble. Reynolds turned toward Emily. You said you think this was a contingency plan. Do you have any experience with how these networks operate when they trigger something like this? Emily nodded slowly. Some. 3 years ago, before the ambush that ended my active status, my team intercepted communications from a similar cell. They ran a doctrine built around exactly this kind of scenario. Hit hard, hit fast, overwhelm a target before reinforcements can arrive. If this is the same network or connected to it, they'll be moving with the intention of a quick, decisive strike, not a prolonged engagement. How quick? If they're 90 minutes out and moving at that speed, I'd estimate they intend to hit within the hour of arrival. They won't want to give us time to fully mobilize a defense. Reynolds turned to Whitfield. Get every available soldier on this base into defensive positions. I want the perimeter reinforced within the next 30 minutes. And somebody get me a secure line to regional command. I need reinforcements moving toward us immediately. Yes, sir. Whitfield moved fast, already barking orders into his radio as he crossed the room. Emily stayed rooted where she stood, her mind working through something Reynolds could see forming behind her eyes, even before she spoke it out loud. General, she said, there's something else you need to consider. What? If this really is connected to the network I dealt with 3 years ago, then whoever's leading that convoy likely knows exactly who took that shot this morning. Networks like this keep records too. If they've been tracking Silent Falcon's activity even loosely over the years, this attack might not just be about retaliating against the base. It might specifically be about me. The words landed heavy in the room, and Reynolds felt the full shape of the situation settling into place, uglier and more personal than he'd initially understood. You're saying they might already know you're here, he said. I'm saying it's possible, Emily said. And if that's true, this isn't just a defensive situation anymore. It's a targeted one. Outside the command center, word was already spreading across the base with the particular electric speed of bad news moving through tight quarters, soldiers abandoning half-finished tasks to grab weapons and take up positions along the perimeter fence. Voices sharp with the kind of controlled fear that came from training, kicking in exactly when it needed to. Sanchez found himself back on the eastern berm, this time with a full combat loadout, instead of a spotting scope, watching the horizon with a tightness in his chest that hadn't fully faded since he'd heard the confirmed hit call less than an hour earlier. Voss approached slowly, his usual swagger completely absent, replaced by something quieter, something that looked almost like a man trying to figure out who he actually was underneath all the noise he usually made. Sanchez, he said. Sanchez didn't look over right away. Sergeant, you spotted for her, for Carter, on that shot. Yeah. Voss was quiet for a moment, staring out at the same shimmering horizon Emily had stared down less than an hour ago. I've been doing this job 11 years, he said finally. 11 years, and I've never seen anything like what she did today. And I spent this whole morning treating her like she didn't belong here. Sanchez turned to look at him now, surprised by the honesty in Voss's voice, a tone he'd never once heard from the man before. You want to know something messed up? Voss continued. I think part of me knew there was something different about her. I think that's actually why I gave her such a hard time. People like that make people like me nervous because they don't need to prove anything, and that makes the rest of us feel like maybe we've spent our whole careers trying to prove something that didn't matter as much as we thought it did. That's actually a pretty honest thing to say, Sergeant. Voss let out a short, humorless laugh. Don't get used to it. I'm not big on apologies. You could apologize to her. I know. Voss looked down at his hands. I will. If we're all still standing after whatever's coming our way. Before Sanchez could respond, the base alarm cracked to life again, different this time, a defensive posture signal, rather than the earlier emergency tone, and both men snapped to attention as Whitfield's voice came booming over the loudspeaker system. All personnel to defensive positions. Repeat, all personnel to defensive positions. This is not a drill. The base transformed within minutes, soldiers moving with the practiced urgency of people who trained for exactly this kind of scenario, even if they'd never expected to actually face it. Machine gun positions being reinforced along the perimeter, vehicles repositioned to provide cover, the entire compound humming with a tension that hadn't existed 12 hours earlier when this had simply been another quiet outpost in the desert. Inside the command center, Reynolds stood over the tactical display watching the 5 red markers representing the approaching convoy inch closer with every passing minute. Whitfield and Delgado flanking him. Alvarez feeding updated information as quickly as her systems could process it. Reinforcements from regional command, Reynolds asked. Estimated 90 minutes out, sir, Whitfield said grimly. Same as the convoy's arrival window. If they hit us the moment they get here, we'll be facing this alone before help arrives. Then we need every advantage we can get in the next 90 minutes, Reynolds said. He turned to find Emily standing near the tactical display studying the convoy's projected path with the same focused intensity she'd brought to her scope earlier. Sergeant Carter, he said, I want your assessment. If this network is as organized as you believe, what's their likely approach? Emily stepped closer to the display, tracing the convoy's projected route with her eyes. They'll avoid a direct frontal assault on fortified positions if they're smart, which based on what I saw 3 years ago, they usually are. I'd expect them to split probe the perimeter for the weakest point and concentrate their force there, rather than spreading thin across the whole fence line. Where's our weakest point? Emily studied the base layout for a long moment. The southeastern corner near the old supply depot. The terrain there gives natural cover for an approaching force, and the fence line hasn't been reinforced in years, based on what I've observed during my patrols. Whitfield's expression tightened. She's right. That section's been on the maintenance list for months. We never got around to it. Then that's where we focus reinforcement, Reynolds said. Whitfield, get engineering out there now. Whatever barriers we can throw up in the next hour, I want them there. Yes, sir. As Whitfield moved to relay the order, the radio on Alvarez's console crackled unexpectedly, a different tone than the standard frequency, and everyone in the room felt the same cold recognition settle over them at once. It was the same frequency, the one that officially didn't exist. Commander, the same calm clinical voice said, I imagine you're preparing defensive positions right about now. That's wise. But I want to be clear about something. This convoy isn't the real threat you should be worried about. Reynolds grabbed the handset immediately. This is General Reynolds. Identify yourself. A pause, then almost amused. You can call me a friend of Falcon's, General, or you can call me someone who's been keeping an eye on a situation you don't fully understand yet. Either works. You said the convoy isn't the real threat, Reynolds said, forcing his voice level, despite the anger building underneath it. Then what is? The convoy is a distraction, the voice said. A loud, obvious one designed to pull every eye on your base toward the southeastern approach while something quieter happens somewhere you're not looking. Emily's head snapped up, her eyes locking onto the radio with an intensity that made the hair on Sanchez's arms stand up even from across the room. What's happening that we're not looking at? She demanded, stepping forward and taking the handset from Reynolds' hand without waiting for permission. Hello, Falcon, the voice said, and there was something almost warm in the tone now, something that made Emily's stomach turn cold. It's good to hear your voice again after all this time. Who are you? Emily said, her voice tight and controlled, in a way that told everyone in that room she was holding back something enormous. Someone who's watched your file for 3 years waiting for the right moment, the voice said. Someone who knows exactly what Colonel Briggs did to bury you and exactly why he did it. And someone who's about to give you the chance to finally do something about it if you're willing to trust me. I don't trust voices on frequencies that don't exist, Emily said. Fair, the voice replied, unbothered. But you should know this while your base is preparing to defend against a convoy of 5 vehicles heading toward your southeastern fence line. There's a 6th team already inside your perimeter. They've been there for approximately 40 minutes, and their objective isn't the base. The room went absolutely silent. Their objective is you, Sergeant Carter. The radio went dead. For a full 3 seconds, nobody in the command center moved, the words hanging in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Inside the perimeter, Reynolds said, finally, his voice low and dangerous. He's saying there are hostiles already on this base. It could be a lie, Delgado said quickly. Psychological warfare trying to fracture our focus right when we need it most. It could be, Emily said, but her expression told a different story entirely. Something that looked less like doubt and more like grim, exhausted recognition. But 3 years ago, this exact network used the same tactic. Loud diversion, quiet infiltration. I watched it happen once before, and I watched good people die because command assumed the obvious threat was the only threat. Reynolds turned to Whitfield. I want every square inch of this base swept immediately. Barracks, motor pool supply, depot, everything. If there's somebody inside our wire, I want them found before that convoy arrives. Yes, sir. Whitfield was already moving radio pressed to his ear, barking orders that sent soldiers scrambling in every direction across the compound. Emily set the radio handset down slowly, her mind racing through possibilities, through faces she'd seen on the base that morning, through every soldier she'd interacted with, searching for anything that had felt wrong, anything she might have missed while she'd been focused on Voss's insults and the general's dismissive glance. Sergeant, Reynolds said, watching her closely. You said this network used this tactic once before. What happened that time? Emily's jaw tightened. That time, the quiet team wasn't going after a person. They were going after intelligence documents or communication logs, anything that would help them understand how deep our operation had penetrated their network. This time, according to that voice, they're going after a person specifically. You. Me, Emily confirmed. Which means whoever's inside this perimeter right now isn't looking to plant a bomb or steal files. They're looking to either capture or eliminate me before I become a bigger problem for whoever's giving them their orders. Sanchez, who had slipped into the command center during the commotion, felt his stomach drop. Then we need to get you somewhere secure, right now. There is no secure on a base this size with an infiltration team already inside, Emily said. Moving me somewhere just gives them a smaller area to search. Then what do you suggest? Reynolds asked. Emily was quiet for a moment, her mind working through the problem with the same cold precision she'd brought to the shot 4 kilometers into the desert less than 2 hours earlier. We flip it, she said finally. If they're hunting me, then I become the bait instead of the target. We control where I am, we control the terrain, and we let them come to us instead of us wasting time searching every building on this base. Reynolds studied her for a long moment. You're suggesting we deliberately expose you. I'm suggesting we stop letting an enemy dictate the terms of this fight, Emily said. I've spent 3 years being invisible because somebody decided that was safer for everyone involved. I'm done being invisible, General. If they want me, let's make sure they find me exactly where we want them to. The room fell into a tense, weighing silence, everyone present understanding the enormity of what she was proposing, understanding also that time was running out with every second they spent debating it. Whitfield's voice crackled back over the radio, tight with urgency. General, we've got something. Motor Pool Sergeant reports a maintenance vehicle that wasn't logged on this morning's roster. 3 individuals inside claiming to be a mobile repair team from Regional Command, but nobody can confirm they were dispatched. Reynolds' eyes snapped to Emily. That's them. Where are they now? Emily asked immediately. Parked near the motor pool, Whitfield said. They haven't moved since the maintenance sergeant flagged them. If they realize they've been noticed, they'll act immediately, Emily finished. We don't have time to wait for confirmation, General. If that's the infiltration team and they figure out we're on to them, this becomes a hostage situation or a firefight in the middle of a base already bracing for an external assault. Reynolds' jaw was set hard, the weight of the decision pressing down on him with a force that made him look every bit his 61 years. What do you need? A clear line to the motor pool and permission to handle this directly, Emily said. Sergeant, if this goes wrong. If we wait, sir, it's already gone wrong, Emily said. I've seen this tactic before. Every minute we spend deliberating is a minute they can use to reposition, and every minute they're inside our wire is a minute this entire base is compromised. Reynolds held her gaze for a long, tense moment, weighing 30 years of caution against the sharp, focused certainty in the eyes of a soldier he'd dismissed as unremarkable less than 3 hours earlier, and had since watched make a shot he still couldn't fully process. Go, he said finally. Whitfield, get her whatever support she needs. Nobody engages without her signal unless lives are immediately at risk. Yes, sir. Emily was already moving, Sanchez falling in step behind her. Without being asked, the two of them cutting across the compound toward the motor pool with the same urgent, controlled pace that had defined every moment since that first radio call had shattered the quiet of an ordinary morning. Sergeant, Sanchez said, half jogging to keep up. If this is really them, if this is really a team sent specifically for you, shouldn't there be more backup than just me? More people means more variables, Emily said, not slowing down. 3 hostiles in a confined space. I need precision, not numbers. And if they're better trained than we think. Emily's expression didn't change, but something in her voice hardened just slightly. Then it's a good thing I've done this before. They reached the edge of the motor pool, taking cover behind a row of parked vehicles, and Emily peered around the edge toward the unmarked maintenance truck, sitting exactly where Whitfield had described its engine, off its occupants, invisible behind tinted windows that gave away absolutely nothing. 3 individuals, Emily murmured, mostly to herself, running through possibilities. If that voice on the radio was telling the truth about their objective, they're not here to blow something up. They're here to extract or eliminate a single target. That means there will be light on heavy weapons, prioritizing speed and precision over firepower. How do you know that? Because that's what I would do, Emily said quietly. Before Sanchez could respond, the driver's side door of the maintenance truck opened slowly, and a man in a nondescript maintenance uniform stepped out, glancing casually around the motor pool in a way that looked almost convincing, almost like an ordinary soldier going about ordinary business. Almost. Emily's eyes narrowed, tracking the way his gaze moved, too deliberate, too methodical, scanning not for equipment or coworkers, but for exit routes, for sight lines, for exactly the kind of tactical assessment a genuine maintenance worker would never think to make. That's him, she whispered. That's the team lead. Watch how he's scanning. That's not a mechanic's eyes, Sanchez. That's an operator's eyes. The man's gaze swept toward their position, and for one heart-stopping second, Emily was certain he'd spotted them, certain the entire careful approach was about to collapse into chaos. Then his radio crackled, faint but audible, even from their distance, and his expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, the look of a man receiving new orders he hadn't expected. He turned back toward the truck and rapped twice on the passenger door, a signal, and within seconds 2 more figures emerged, moving with the same too-practiced casualness, the same operator's precision hidden under civilian uniforms that fooled nobody who knew what they were looking for. They're moving, Sanchez whispered, tension coiling through his entire body. Sergeant, they're moving. Emily watched every muscle coiled tight as the 3 figures began walking, not toward the perimeter, not toward an exit, but directly across the compound toward the command center, toward the very building where General Reynolds was standing at that exact moment, utterly unaware that the threat he'd sent Emily to intercept had just changed its target entirely. They're not here for me specifically. Emily breathed, the realization crashing over her with sickening clarity. They know I'm not in the command center right now. They're going after Reynolds. Why would they? Because Reynolds authorized my activation, Emily said, already moving, already breaking cover, her voice sharp with urgency. If this is connected to Briggs, if Briggs is trying to bury this before it goes any further, removing the general who just reactivated Silent Falcon accomplishes exactly what he needs. It erases the authorization. It erases the witness. And it does it before Regional Command even fully understands what happened here today. She broke into a dead run across the compound, Sanchez sprinting behind her. Both of them cutting an angle that would intercept the 3 figures before they reached the command center doors, And as they ran, Emily keyed her radio with a desperate, urgent transmission that cut across every channel on the base at once. All units, all units. Hostile contact inside the perimeter, converging on command center. I need eyes on General Reynolds. Immediately repeat, the general is the target, not me. The general is the target. Her voice cut off as the first shot rang out from somewhere near the command center, sharp and sudden freezing. Every soldier on that base in place for one horrifying suspended second before the entire compound erupted into chaos. The shot echoed off the command center walls, and every soldier on that compound dropped into a crouch on pure instinct, weapons coming up, eyes scanning for a target that hadn't revealed itself yet. Inside the command center, Reynolds had already moved 30 years of combat instinct, overriding the surprise of the moment, throwing himself sideways behind the heavy steel filing cabinet, bolted against the far wall as the door burst inward. The first operative came through, low and fast weapon raised, and Whitfield, standing closest to the entrance, barely had time to register the threat before the man's rifle swept toward him. "Down!" Delgado shouted, tackling Whitfield sideways as a round punched through the wall, exactly where his head had been half a second earlier. Alvarez says, dove under her console, hands scrambling for the sidearm holstered at her waist, her training kicking in through the fog of adrenaline flooding her system. "Hostiles in the command center!" She screamed into her radio voice, cracking with panic she didn't have time to control. "Multiple shooters, I need backup now." The lead operative scanned the room fast. Professional cold, clearly disappointed not to find his primary target standing in the open, and his eyes locked onto Reynolds' cover position behind the filing cabinet. "General," the man said, his voice flat, almost bored, like this was simply another task on a checklist. "Step out, this doesn't have to get complicated." Reynolds' hand found the sidearm at his hip, fingers closing around the grip with a steadiness that surprised even him. "You've made a serious mistake walking onto my base." "The mistake was yours," the operative said, moving closer, weapon trained on the cabinet, authorizing Silent Falcon back into active service. Some people really wanted that door to stay closed. Outside, Emily and Sanchez hit the compound at a dead sprint, the sound of gunfire from the command center driving them faster than either of their bodies wanted to go, lungs burning, boots pounding against packed earth. "Two shooters confirmed inside," Sanchez gasped, listening to the chaotic radio traffic flooding every channel at once. "Third one's unaccounted for." "Watch our flanks," Emily said, not slowing. "If there's a third, he's covering the exterior, making sure nobody interferes." They rounded the corner of the supply building, and Emily's instincts screamed a half second before her eyes confirmed it. A figure crouched near the command center's side entrance, rifle raised sightline, locked on the main doors, waiting for exactly the kind of interruption Emily and Sanchez represented. "Down!" Emily shoved Sanchez sideways into cover as the third operative's weapon swung toward them and fired the round splintering wood inches from where Sanchez's head had been a heartbeat earlier. Emily didn't hesitate. She brought her sidearm up, no time for the Barrett. Now no time for calculations, just raw, trained reflex, and fired twice in rapid succession. The operative staggered his shot, going wide, and before he could recover his footing, Emily closed the distance and put him down with a third final shot. Silence, brief and ringing, settled over that corner of the compound. "Sergeant," Sanchez breathed, staring at her with something between shock and awe, the same expression he'd worn after the impossible shot 2 hours earlier. "You just..." "Later," Emily said, already moving toward the command center entrance. Sidearm raised every cell in her body, narrowing down to the singular objective of reaching Reynolds before the two remaining operatives finished what they'd come to do. "Stay behind me. Watch my six." Inside, the standoff had reached a breaking point. Reynolds crouched behind the cabinet, his sidearm gripped tight, calculating angles, calculating odds, doing the math every soldier learns to do when the difference between living and dying comes down to fractions of a second. "Last chance, General," the lead operative said, circling slowly, weapon never wavering. "Tell us where Carter is and this ends peacefully. Nobody else has to get hurt today." "You already tried to hurt plenty of people," Reynolds said, buying time listening for anything, any sign of support arriving. "Doesn't sound peaceful to me." "Semantics," the operative said. "Time's up." He raised his weapon toward the cabinet, finger tightening on the trigger, and in that exact instant, the command center door exploded open behind him. Emily came through low, fast, and utterly precise, her sidearm already tracking the second operative standing near the far wall before he'd even fully registered her presence. 2 shots, controlled, deliberate, and he went down before he could bring his own weapon to bear. The lead operative spun toward the new threat, and for half a second his weapon swung away from Reynolds' position toward Emily, instead exactly the opening Reynolds needed. "Now!" Reynolds shouted and fired from behind the cabinet, his round catching the operative in the shoulder, spinning him off balance. Emily closed the remaining distance in 3 fast strides and drove the butt of her pistol into the man's jaw, dropping him fully to the ground, disarming him before he could recover enough to reach for the weapon still clutched in his good hand. The command center fell into a ringing, disbelieving silence, broken only by Whitfield's ragged breathing from where Delgado had tackled him to the floor, and Alvarez slowly rising from beneath her console sidearm, still shaking in her grip. "Clear," Emily said, kicking the fallen weapon away from the operative's reach. Her voice steady despite the chaos still fading from the room around her. "Sanchez, secure him." Sanchez moved fast, zip-tying the operative's wrists with hands that hadn't fully stopped shaking, while Emily crossed the room toward Reynolds, extending a hand to help him up from behind the cabinet. Reynolds took it, rising slowly, staring at her with an expression that had shifted yet again, moving past confusion, past disbelief, into something that looked almost like awe mixed with a profound, uncomfortable humility. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "You authorized my activation," Emily said. "Seemed only fair." Outside, the sound of engines grew louder, and for a horrifying second, everyone in that room assumed it was the convoy finally arriving, but the radio crackled with Whitfield's relieved voice confirming what the sound actually meant. "That's Regional Command," he said, staring at his radio like it had just delivered a miracle. "Reinforcements. They made better time than projected." Relief flooded through the room, but Emily's expression didn't soften her attention, already shifting back to the bound operative groaning on the floor. "We still have a convoy inbound," she said, "and we still don't know who's actually giving these people their orders." Reynolds looked down at the operative, then back at Emily. "Then let's find out." Emily knelt beside the man, studying his face with the same cold, analytical focus she'd brought to the wind and the mirage 4 kilometers out in the desert hours earlier. "You're not going to get anything from me," the operative spat through a bloodied lip. "I don't need much," Emily said calmly. "Just a name, because I already have a strong guess, and all I really need from you is confirmation." The man's eyes flickered just slightly, and Emily caught it the same way she caught wind patterns and mirage distortions, the small tells that gave away more than words ever could. "Briggs," she said quietly. "You're working for Colonel Briggs, General Briggs now, isn't it?" The operative's jaw tightened, and though he said nothing, his silence told Emily everything she needed to know. "That's confirmation enough," she said, standing, turning back toward Reynolds. "General, I think it's time we contact Regional Command directly, not through normal channels. Briggs sits high enough in the chain now that a standard report could get intercepted or buried before it reaches anyone who would actually act on it." Reynolds nodded slowly, the full political weight of the situation settling onto him. "You're asking me to go over the head of a 2-star general based on the word of a captured operative and a call sign nobody can officially verify. I'm asking you to trust what you've seen with your own eyes today," Emily said. "I made a shot your best trained snipers said was impossible. I stopped an assassination attempt in your own command center. And everything that's happened since this morning traces back to a man who buried my career 3 years ago, specifically because I exposed an intelligence failure that got 11 soldiers nearly killed. I'm not asking you to take a leap of faith, General. I'm asking you to follow the evidence." Reynolds studied her for a long moment, and Sanchez, standing nearby, could see the exact instant something shifted behind the general's eyes, the moment 30 years of institutional caution gave way to something more fundamental, the simple, unshakable respect for a soldier who had proven beyond any reasonable doubt that she was exactly who she claimed to be. "Alvarez," Reynolds said, "get me a secure line to the Pentagon, not Regional Command. Dashan, I want to speak directly with the Inspector General's office." Alvarez blinked. "Sir, that's a significant escalation." "I'm aware," Reynolds said. "Do it anyway." As Alvarez moved to comply, the base alarm cracked to life once more, and everyone in the room felt their stomachs drop in unison, certain the convoy had finally arrived. But the voice that came over the loudspeaker wasn't sounding an attack warning. It was Whitfield's second-in-command, breathless, confused. "General, you need to see this. The approaching convoy they've stopped. All 5 vehicles. They're sitting there, not advancing." Reynolds exchanged a glance with Emily. "That doesn't make sense. Why would they stop 30 minutes from the base after mobilizing this fast Emily's mind raced through possibilities, and then slowly a theory began forming, cold and clear. Because their real objective already failed, she said. The convoy was never meant to actually engage this base directly, General. I think Delgado had it half right earlier. It was a distraction, but not just for the infiltration team. It was a distraction to buy time for Briggs to get whatever information his people gathered here and get it back to him before anyone here could report it up the chain. But the infiltration team failed, Reynolds said, slowly, understanding dawning. Which means Briggs doesn't know yet that his people failed, Emily finished. That convoy is probably waiting for a signal that never comes now. Once enough time passes without confirmation, they'll likely withdraw rather than risk exposure without the intelligence they were supposed to gather. Reynolds turned to Whitfield. Keep every defensive position manned. I don't want to assume anything based on a theory, even a good one. But get me that line to the Inspector General immediately. Yes, sir. Over the following 90 minutes, the base held its collective breath, watching the convoy on the tactical display, 5 red markers sitting motionless on the horizon, while Alvarez worked frantically to establish a secure connection to Washington, and gradually, the markers began retreating, pulling back the way they'd come, exactly as Emily had predicted. By the time Alvarez finally got a live connection routed through to the Inspector General's office, the compound had settled into an exhausted, watchful quiet, soldiers still manning their positions, but the immediate threat visibly receding into the desert haze. Reynolds took the call in his office, Emily standing beside him, and for nearly 40 minutes he laid out everything: the activation, the impossible shot, the encrypted transmissions from a channel that officially didn't exist, the infiltration team, the captured operatives' confirmation, and finally the 3-year-old ambush that had buried Sergeant Emily Carter's career to protect a man who now sat 2 stars higher than he deserved. When the call ended, Reynolds set the phone down, slowly rubbing a hand across his tired face. They're opening a formal investigation, he said, effective immediately. Briggs is being placed on administrative leave pending review, and they're sending an independent team to interview everyone involved, starting with you. Emily nodded slowly, and for the first time since that morning, something in her posture shifted, not quite relief, but something adjacent to it, the loosening of a tension she'd been carrying so long, she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to set it down. 3 years, she said quietly. 3 years of being told I didn't exist, that what I did didn't matter, that the truth wasn't worth the trouble it would cause. I'm sorry, Reynolds said, and the words carried genuine weight, none of the hollow formality that usually accompanied an apology from someone of his rank. I walked past you this morning without a second glance. I judged you exactly the way this entire system judged you 3 years ago, based on nothing but assumptions. Emily looked at him, and for a moment the careful patience she'd worn like armor for 5 years softened just slightly. You corrected it, General. Not everybody does. It shouldn't have taken almost losing my life in my own command center to see what was right in front of me the whole time. No, Emily agreed. It shouldn't have, but it did, and now we fix what we can. Word of what had happened moved through Fort Raven Ridge with a speed that outpaced even the panic of the initial alarmed soldiers gathering in small clusters, trading versions of the story that grew slightly more incredible with each retelling, until by evening, nearly everyone on that base had heard some form of the truth that the quiet woman on the eastern berm, the one Voss had mocked and the general had ignored, had made an impossible shot, stopped an assassination attempt, and exposed a cover-up that reached all the way to a 2-star general. Voss found her that evening near the motor pool, standing alone, the way she so often did, checking over the Barrett Infiltration 2 with the same careful attention she gave it every single day. Sergeant Carter, he said, and his voice carried none of its usual edge. Emily looked up. Master Sergeant. He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable, clearly working through words he wasn't accustomed to using. I owe you an apology. A real one, not the kind people say just to get it over with. Emily set down her cleaning cloth, giving him her full attention. I spent this morning treating you like you didn't belong here, Voss continued. Like carrying that rifle was some kind of favor somebody did for you instead of something you had earned. And then I watched you make a shot I couldn't make in conditions that should have made it impossible. And I watched you walk into a firefight to save a general's life without hesitating for a single second. I was wrong about you. Not just wrong, I was cruel about being wrong, and there's no excuse for that. Emily studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression eased the careful guardedness she carried around, most people softening just slightly around the edges. You know what the hardest part of the last 5 years has been, Voss, she said. It wasn't the insults. It wasn't being underestimated. It was watching people make their minds up about who I was before they'd ever bothered to actually see me. You did that. Today, you stopped doing it. That matters more than the apology. Voss nodded slowly, something like genuine respect settling into his expression for the first time since Emily had known him. For what it's worth, Sergeant, if you ever need a spotter, I'd consider it an honor. I already have a good one, Emily said, glancing toward Sanchez, who was crossing the compound toward them, still wearing the slightly stunned expression that had settled over his face sometime around the moment he'd watched Emily drop an armed operative with 3 precise shots. But I'll keep the offer in mind. Sanchez reached them, falling into step, and for a moment the three of them stood together in a silence that felt different from every silence that had passed between them that day, easier settled, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm has finally passed through. General wants to see you, Sanchez said to Emily. Says it's important. Emily nodded, shouldering her rifle out of habit, and made her way back toward the command building, where Reynolds was waiting in his office, standing near the window, looking out at the base that had nearly fallen apart, and somehow against every odd held together. Sergeant, he said, turning as she entered, I wanted to tell you something before the Inspector General's team arrives tomorrow, and this whole situation officially becomes bigger than either of us. Sir, I've recommended you for immediate reinstatement to full active operational status, Reynolds said. Your original rank restored your commendations from 3 years ago, officially entered back into your record and given today's events. I've also recommended you for the Silver Star. What you did today, both the shot and the firefight, that's not something that happens once in a career. Most soldiers never see anything close to it in 30 years. Emily was quiet for a long moment, processing words she'd stopped allowing herself to hope for somewhere around the 2nd year of her exile. I didn't do it for recognition, sir, she said finally. I know, Reynolds said. That's exactly why you deserve it. Outside, the desert sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep red, the same sky that had watched an entire base underestimate a soldier that morning and watched that same soldier save it by afternoon. There's something else, Reynolds said, his tone shifting, growing more serious. The Inspector General's investigation is going to be thorough, but investigations like this take time, and Briggs isn't going to go down without using every resource available to him to protect himself. I need to know you're prepared for what's coming. This isn't over just because today ended in our favor. Emily's eyes hardened slightly, the exhaustion of the day settling into something more resolute. I've been prepared for this for 3 years, General. I just didn't know when the moment would finally come. And now that it has, now I intend to make sure it counts, Emily said. Briggs buried me once because the truth was inconvenient. I don't intend to give him or anyone else that kind of power again. Reynolds studied her, and something in his expression carried a mixture of respect and genuine concern, the look of a man who had seen enough institutional battles in his career to know that the fight ahead of Emily wouldn't be fought with rifles or scopes, but with paperwork, testimony, and the slow grinding machinery of military bureaucracy that could bury the truth just as easily as it could reveal it. You won't be fighting it alone, he said. I'm putting my own career behind this investigation. Whatever it costs me, it's a debt I owe you for today, and honestly for 3 years of a system that failed you long before I ever had the chance to. Emily nodded and, for the first time all day, allowed herself something that looked almost like the beginning of real relief. A loosening in her shoulders, a softening around her eyes that Sanchez, watching from the doorway, hadn't seen from her in all the weeks he'd known her. Thank you, General, she said quietly. Don't thank me yet, Reynolds said. Thank me when Briggs is sitting in front of a review board instead of a command desk. That night, as the base finally settled into an uneasy quiet, soldiers rotating through exhausted debriefs and medical checks, Emily found herself back on the Eastern Berm alone, the way she'd been every night for 5 years, except tonight felt different, in a way she was still struggling to name. Sanchez found her there an hour later, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the mess hall, and sat down beside her without asking permission, the way he'd started doing sometime in the middle of that impossibly long day. Quite a first week, huh? He said, handing her a cup. Emily allowed herself a small, tired laugh, the first genuine laugh Sanchez had heard from her since he'd met her. I've had quieter first weeks. I bet. He was quiet for a moment, staring out at the darkening desert. Can I ask you something? You can ask. After everything that happened today, after everyone finally seeing who you really are, Does it feel different, being seen? Emily considered the question carefully, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands, looking out at the same horizon where that morning a general had walked past her without a second glance, and where hours later she'd made a shot that would follow her reputation for the rest of her career. It feels good, she admitted, but it's not really what I was fighting for Sanchez. I wasn't out there today trying to prove I mattered. I already knew I mattered. I was out there because 11 soldiers needed someone to make an impossible call 3 years ago, and today a general needed someone willing to make an impossible shot. Being seen is nice, but it was never really the point. Sanchez nodded slowly, absorbing that, filing it away the way young soldiers file away lessons that take years to fully understand. What happens now, he asked. With Briggs, with the investigation, with all of it? Emily looked out at the darkening horizon at the first stars beginning to emerge over the desert, and for a moment her expression carried the weight of everything still ahead, the fight that was only just beginning, even though the day's battle had ended. Now, she said quietly, we find out whether the truth is finally strong enough to survive contact with the people who've spent 3 years trying to bury it. Somewhere beyond the base perimeter, far to the east, the taillights of the retreating convoy had long since disappeared into the darkness, but Emily knew with the same cold certainty that had guided her hand on the trigger that morning that this was far from over. Briggs would not go quietly. Whoever had spoken to her over that impossible frequency clearly had their own agenda, one that hadn't been fully revealed yet. And somewhere in Washington, powerful people were about to discover that the soldier they'd buried 3 years ago had climbed back out of that grave with a rifle in her hands and nothing left to lose. Morning came to Fort Raven Ridge the way it always did, slow and merciless, the sun climbing over the eastern ridge and setting the whole desert on fire with light. Except this time, nobody on that base watched the sunrise the same way they had the day before. Word had spread overnight through every barracks and every guard rotation, whispered in mess lines and radio checks, until by the time the first Inspector General vehicle rolled through the main gate, every soldier at Raven Ridge understood they were about to witness something that would follow this base for the rest of its history. Emily stood near the flagpole with Reynolds watching the black sedan pull to a stop, 3 figures stepping out in crisp civilian suits that looked strangely out of place against the dust and gravel of a working military outpost. That's Colonel Marissa Tran, Reynolds said quietly, recognizing the lead investigator. She doesn't run soft investigations. If she's here personally, that tells you how seriously the Inspector General's office is taking this. Good, Emily said. I don't want soft, I want thorough. Tran approached with the brisk efficiency of someone who had spent a career cutting through excuses, extending a hand first to Reynolds, then to Emily, her eyes lingering on Emily for an extra beat, the way people look at someone whose name has suddenly become significant. Sergeant Carter, she said, I've read the preliminary report General Reynolds submitted last night. I have to say, in 22 years doing this job, I've never opened a file quite like yours. With respect, ma'am, I'd rather it hadn't taken 3 years and a base assault to open it at all. Tran's expression didn't waver, but something in her eyes acknowledged the weight of that statement. Neither would I, Sergeant. That's exactly why I'm here. They moved into the command center, and for the next 6 hours, Emily sat across from Tran and her team, walking through every detail, the ambush 3 years earlier, the 4-second decision that saved 11 lives, the faulty intelligence that had put her team in that valley in the first place, the reclassification of her records, the sealing of her call sign, the quiet reassignment to a forgotten outpost where nobody would think to ask why a decorated sniper was pulling support rotation duty. Tran took notes without interrupting, occasionally exchanging glances with the 2 investigators flanking. And when Emily finally finished, the room sat in a heavy, considering silence. I want to be direct with you, Sergeant, Tran said finally. What you're describing isn't just a career injustice. If everything in your account holds up under verification, and I have no reason yet to doubt it, this points toward a deliberate falsification of an after-action report to protect a senior officer's career at the expense of a subordinate who did nothing wrong except tell the truth. That's not a personnel issue. That's a crime. I'm aware, Emily said. Then you should also be aware that men like Briggs don't fall quietly. He's had 3 years to build relationships, call in favors, position himself in ways that make him difficult to touch. This investigation is going to get uncomfortable before it gets resolved. I've been uncomfortable for 3 years, Colonel, Emily said. I can handle uncomfortable. Something like respect flickered across Tran's face. I believe you can. Outside the command center, Sanchez paced near the entrance, unable to sit still, unable to focus on any of his assigned duties, while Emily's entire future sat balanced somewhere behind that closed door. Voss found him there an hour into the wait, leaning against the wall with a stillness that hadn't been part of his personality 24 hours earlier. You look like you're about to wear a hole straight through that gravel, Voss said. I keep thinking about what happens if this doesn't work, Sanchez admitted. If Briggs is as connected as everyone keeps saying, what if he just makes this whole investigation disappear the same way he made her career disappear 3 years ago? Voss was quiet for a moment, considering the question with more weight than Sanchez expected from him. You know what I noticed yesterday watching her work, that rifle, watching her clear that command center, like she'd done it 100 times before? She's not the kind of person who waits for the system to save her. She's the kind of person who makes sure the system doesn't have a choice. That's not really an answer. No, Voss admitted, but it's the only comfort I've got. Inside, the interviews continued through the afternoon. Whitfield and Delgado giving their accounts of the assassination attempt, Alvarez walking Tran's team through the encrypted transmissions on a frequency that officially didn't exist, and the captured operative still in custody, refusing to speak beyond confirming, once again under formal questioning, that his orders had traced back through a chain that ultimately led to Briggs. By evening, Tran gathered the key witnesses together one final time, her expression carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent an entire day confirming something she'd suspected within the first hour. Here's where we stand, she said. General Briggs has already been notified of the investigation, which means whatever moves he's going to make to protect himself, he's likely already making them. I've requested an immediate freeze on his access to classified networks and personnel files, but bureaucracy moves slower than we'd like, and there's a real possibility he gets ahead of us before those restrictions take effect. What does that mean in practice? Reynolds asked. It means he still has access to information right now that could let him identify and pressure anyone connected to this investigation, Tran said, her eyes moving toward Emily. Sergeant, I need to ask you something directly. That voice on the encrypted channel, the one who claimed to know about Briggs, the one who essentially engineered your reactivation. Do you have any theory at all about who that might be? Emily had turned this question over in her mind more times than she could count since the previous morning, and she still didn't have an answer that felt complete. Someone with access to classified frequencies that were supposedly purged, she said slowly. Someone who knew details about my case that were sealed at a level above even General Reynolds' clearance. Someone who wanted Briggs exposed badly enough to manipulate an entire base into a crisis just to force my hand. That's a short list of people, Tran said. It's a short list of people I don't have names for, Emily said, which is its own kind of problem. That night, long after the investigators had retired to the visiting officers' quarters and the base had settled into its second uneasy night in a row, Emily sat alone in the small room she'd been assigned since arriving at Raven Ridge, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the past 36 hours in a loop that refused to slow down. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find Reynolds standing there alone, out of uniform, wearing an expression she hadn't seen from him before, something tired and unguarded. General, she said, surprised. I couldn't sleep, he admitted. Mind if I come in for a minute? She stepped aside and he entered, glancing around the sparse room, the same kind of room every junior soldier on this base occupied, nothing marking it as belonging to someone who'd once carried a call sign that made veteran operators go pale. I keep thinking about something, Reynolds said, sitting down in the room's single chair. 3 years ago, when your career got buried, there had to be officers above Briggs who signed off on that reclassification, who approved sealing your records. Whoever did that, they either knew the truth and chose to protect Briggs anyway, or they never asked the questions they should have asked. Probably both, Emily said. That's usually how these things work. It makes me wonder how many other soldiers are sitting exactly where you were sitting yesterday morning, Reynolds said quietly. Overlooked, buried, quietly punished for being inconvenient, and nobody ever finds out because nobody ever asks the question that gets them a general walking past their position during a routine inspection. Emily was quiet for a long moment. I used to wonder that too, she said finally. In the beginning. Then I stopped because it hurt too much to think about, and I needed to be able to function every single day without that thought eating through me. And now, Now, I think maybe that's exactly why this matters, Emily said. Not just for me, for whoever comes after me and finds themselves in the same position. Reynolds nodded slowly, and for a moment, neither of them said anything, the silence carrying a weight that felt less like discomfort and more like two people who'd both nearly died the day before finally allowing themselves to sit with what that meant. I wanted to tell you something else, Reynolds said finally. Before all of this happened before yesterday, I'd started to believe that 30 years in this uniform meant I understood how to read people, how to spot value, how to recognize what mattered on a base full of soldiers. Yesterday morning, I proved to myself in front of my own troops that I understood almost nothing at all. You corrected it, Emily said, echoing words she'd told him once already. I'm trying to, Reynolds said. But Sergeant, I need you to understand something. Whatever happens with this investigation, however Briggs's story ends, I will not let this base or this army quietly forget what you did yesterday or what was done to you 3 years before that. I owe you more than a recommendation letter and a medal. Emily looked at him, and something in her chest, something that had been clenched tight for 3 years, loosened just slightly. Thank you, General, she said quietly. That actually means more than you probably realize. The next morning brought a development nobody at Raven Ridge had anticipated. Alvarez burst into the command center barely past dawn, her face pale, a tablet clutched in her shaking hands. General Colonel Tran, you need to see this right now, she said. It's Briggs. He's gone public with a preemptive statement claiming that Sergeant Carter fabricated the entire ambush story 3 years ago to cover for an unauthorized engagement that violated direct orders, and that yesterday's activity here was staged an elaborate deception to discredit him before he could be considered for a promotion. He's apparently up for next month. The room went cold. He's accusing her of lying, Whitfield said, disbelief coloring his voice. He's accusing her of orchestrating this entire situation, Alvarez confirmed. He's already got statements out through defense contacts, media, contacts framing himself as the victim of a smear campaign by a disgruntled former operator, with, and I'm quoting directly here, a documented history of insubordination and unauthorized use of lethal force. Emily felt something hard and cold settle into her stomach, the familiar sickening sensation of watching the truth get rewritten in real time by someone with more resources and more reach than she had ever possessed. He's fast, Tran said grimly, reading through the statement on Alvarez's tablet. Faster than I expected. This isn't a man improvising, this is a man who's had a defense prepared for years in case this exact scenario ever surfaced. Can he actually make that stick? Reynolds asked. We have a captured operative who confirmed the chain of command. We have the recorded transmissions. We have the operation records from 3 years ago, even sealed, they still exist. He doesn't need it to stick permanently, Tran said. He just needs it to stick long enough to muddy the waters, delay the investigation, buy time to either bury evidence or pressure witnesses. That's how these things usually work at his level. It's not about winning outright. It's about making the truth expensive enough that people stop chasing it. Emily stood very still, her mind racing through implications, and Sanchez, watching her from across the room, could see the exact moment something shifted in her expression. Not fear, but a kind of grim, focused resolve that reminded him uncomfortably of the look she'd worn right before pulling the trigger on that impossible shot 2 days earlier. Then we don't let the waters get muddy, she said. What do you mean, Reynolds asked. I mean, if Briggs is going public, then so do we, Emily said. Quietly discrediting an inconvenient soldier works when the story stays contained to internal channels and sealed files. It doesn't work as well when there are witnesses' records and a captured operative all telling the same story in public view. Tran studied her carefully. You're talking about taking this outside official channels. I'm talking about making sure the truth has more than one door it can walk through, Emily said. If Briggs controls every internal pathway this investigation could take, we find pathways he doesn't control. That's a significant risk, Sergeant, Tran said. Going around official channels could compromise the very investigation you're trying to protect. With respect, Colonel, official channels are exactly what buried me 3 years ago, Emily said. I trust this investigation. I trust General Reynolds. I don't trust that trust alone is going to be enough against a 2-star general who's already 3 moves ahead of us. The room fell into a tense silence, everyone present weighing the enormous risk of what Emily was suggesting against the equally enormous risk of doing nothing while Briggs rewrote the narrative in real time. Before anyone could respond, Alvarez's console crackled again, that same familiar, impossible frequency, and every head in the room turned toward it at once. Command, the calm, clinical voice said, the same voice that had first activated Emily 2 days earlier. I imagine you've seen General Briggs's statement by now. I'd like to offer some assistance if you're willing to hear it. Reynolds grabbed the handset immediately, his patience for mysterious, untraceable interruptions clearly exhausted. I'm done with cryptic messages. If you have something to offer, identify yourself and explain exactly what you want. A pause longer this time, like the person on the other end was weighing a decision they'd been putting off for a very long time. My name is Colonel Ray Delacroix, the voice said finally. Retired. I ran the Joint Task Force operation Sergeant Carter served under 3 years ago before I was quietly forced into early retirement myself for reasons that I imagine will sound very familiar to everyone in that room. Emily's breath caught. You were my commanding officer's superior. I remember your name from the operation briefings, but I never met you directly. No, Delacroix said. By the time you needed someone in my position to stand up for what actually happened in that valley, I'd already been quietly pushed out for asking too many questions about how Briggs's intelligence had gotten so badly compromised in the first place. I've spent 3 years watching from the outside, unable to do anything official because officially, I don't exist to this army anymore either. Then why now? Reynolds asked. Why activate her yesterday? Why put an entire base at risk instead of simply coming forward with what you know? Because what I know on its own is just one retired officer's word against a sitting 2-star general with powerful friends, Delacroix said. Nobody would have listened to me 3 years ago, and nobody would listen to me now, not without something undeniable to back it up. I needed proof that couldn't be buried, couldn't be dismissed, couldn't be quietly reframed as an old grudge. I needed the world to see exactly what Sergeant Carter is capable of under exactly the kind of pressure Briggs's incompetence created in the first place. You used us, Reynolds said, anger creeping into his voice. You used my base, my soldiers as bait to force a confrontation you wanted. I gave you a chance to see the truth with your own eyes, General, in a way no report or testimony ever could have, Delacroix said, unbothered by the accusation. And I'll remind you that Convoy and that infiltration team weren't mine. Those were Briggs's people reacting to a threat I engineered, yes, but reacting with the exact kind of ruthless, illegal aggression that proves precisely what kind of man you're dealing with. I didn't create his corruption, General. I just made sure it finally had somewhere to show itself. Emily's jaw was tight, processing the revelation with a complicated mixture of anger and something almost like gratitude, the two feelings tangled together in a way that made it difficult to know which one to trust. You could have told me, she said quietly, instead of putting me through 2 days of not knowing who was on the other end of that radio. I could have, Delacroix admitted, and for the first time something like genuine regret entered his voice. But you've been burned before by people you trusted, Sergeant, and I needed you operating on your instincts alone, unclouded by whatever loyalty or suspicion my name might have carried. I needed to see if the woman in those old reports was still in there, still capable of what she'd done in that valley. I needed to know honestly whether this was still worth the risk to everyone involved before I revealed myself. And now that you know, Reynolds asked. Now I have something for you, Delacroix said. Something I've kept for 3 years waiting for exactly this moment. A complete, unaltered copy of the original intelligence briefing from that operation, the one Briggs falsified before submitting the official version, along with internal communications proving he knew the location data was unreliable before he sent Sergeant Carter's unit into that valley anyway. I'm transmitting it to Colonel Tran's secure line right now. Tran's tablet chimed almost instantly, and she stared down at it, her expression shifting from cautious skepticism into something sharper. More focused, the look of a career investigator, realizing she was holding exactly the kind of evidence that could end a career in a cover-up in the same stroke. This is, she said, slowly scrolling through the document. This is exactly what we needed. Time-stamped internal communications showing Briggs's awareness of the intelligence failure before the operation and his direct involvement in falsifying the after-action report and afterward to protect himself. This isn't circumstantial anymore. This is documented proof. There's something else, Delacroix's voice continued. Briggs isn't just protecting himself over one buried operation. My research over the past 3 years indicates a pattern, at least 2 other incidents where inconvenient truths got quietly buried through the same methods, Reclassified records, sealed files, soldiers reassigned to positions where nobody would think to ask questions. I'm transmitting those records as well. The room absorbed this in stunned silence. The scope of what they were uncovering expanding far beyond a single injustice 3 years in the past. How many soldiers, Emily said quietly, almost to herself, echoing the question Reynolds had asked her the night before. At minimum 4 that I've been able to confirm, Delacroix said, possibly more that I haven't found yet. Reynolds' expression had hardened into something Sanchez had never seen on the general's face before, a cold, focused fury that had nothing performative about it at all. Colonel Toronto, Reynolds said, I want this evidence secured, verified, and moving through every appropriate channel within the hour. And I want protective measures in place for every soldier this man identified immediately before Briggs realizes exactly how much has just been exposed. Already on it, General, Tran said, already moving, already issuing instructions to her team with a renewed urgency that hadn't been there minutes earlier. The radio crackled one final time. Sergeant Carter, Delacroix said, for what it's worth, I'm sorry it took this long and cost you this much to finally give you the chance to be seen. You deserve better than 3 years of silence. Emily stood quietly for a moment, feeling the weight of that apology settle somewhere deep in her chest, mixing with 3 years of buried anger and exhaustion in a way that left her unsure whether to feel grateful or simply finally allowed to grieve what those years had cost her. Thank you, Colonel, she said finally. I hope this means something changes now, not just for me. It will, Delacroix said. I intend to make sure of it. The transmission ended, and this time when the static settled, it felt different than it had before. Less like an unanswered question and more like a door finally fully opening. Over the following 72 hours, the situation at Fort Raven Ridge and far beyond it moved with a speed that left even Reynolds struggling to keep pace. Tran's team verified Delacroix's evidence against existing sealed records, finding it airtight, unimpeachable, exactly the kind of documentation that made Briggs's public statement collapse under its own contradictions within a single news cycle. The captured operative, faced with the mounting evidence and the very real possibility of spending the rest of his life in federal prison, agreed to a formal statement identifying the exact chain of command that had ordered the infiltration and assassination attempt, tracing every link directly back to Briggs's office. By the 4th day, General Harold Briggs was formally relieved of duty, placed under investigation, not just for the falsified intelligence report and the cover-up that followed, but for authorizing an unlawful attack against a United States military installation, an act that transformed the entire situation from an internal personnel scandal into something approaching a criminal prosecution with national implications. Emily learned of his arrest through a phone call from Colonel Tron, standing on the same eastern berm where this entire nightmare had begun, the Barrett M82, resting against her shoulder the way it always did, a habit she doubted she'd ever fully break, even after everything that had happened. It's done, Tran said, her voice carrying the particular satisfaction of someone who'd spent a career chasing exactly this kind of resolution and rarely getting to see it through to completion. Briggs was taken into custody this morning. Formal charges are being prepared. Sergeant, I don't say this lightly, but this is one of the most significant accountability cases the Inspector General's office has closed in years. And it happened because you refused to let 3 years of silence be the final word on what happened to you. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, feeling something enormous and complicated settle over her, relief tangled with grief, vindication tangled with the exhaustion of having carried this fight alone for so long. Thank you for believing me, Colonel, she said. I didn't just believe you, Sergeant, Tran said. The evidence spoke for itself. All I did was make sure it finally had somewhere to go. That evening, Fort Raven Ridge held an impromptu gathering near the flagpole, soldiers filtering in from every corner of the base, drawn by word that had spread faster than any official announcement could have managed. Reynolds stood at the front, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the formal distance of a typical command address. 3 days ago, he said, addressing the assembled soldiers, I walked past a sergeant on the eastern berm without learning her name, without asking about her service, without seeing anything beyond the assumptions I'd already made about who belonged on this base and who was simply passing through it. That mistake nearly cost every single one of you far more than any of us understood at the time. He paused, looking out over the gathered faces, finding Emily standing near the back, Sanchez and Voss on either side of her. Sergeant Emily Carter is being reinstated effective immediately to her full operational rank and status with every commendation from her original service record restored, Reynolds continued. She has additionally been recommended for the Silver Star for actions taken during the events of this week, actions that saved this base, saved my own life, and exposed a corruption that reached far beyond anything any of us imagined when this began. A murmur moved through the crowd, and Reynolds waited for it to settle before continuing. But I want every soldier standing here today to understand something more important than any medal or promotion, he said. The lesson of this week isn't just about one remarkable soldier. It's about every soldier standing quietly at the edges of formations, doing their job without recognition, without applause, without anyone bothering to ask what they've actually done or what they're actually capable of. This base, this army, we don't get to decide someone's value by how loudly they announce themselves. Sergeant Carter never asked for attention. She never demanded recognition. She simply did the job every single day, whether anyone was watching or not, and that is exactly the kind of soldier this uniform is supposed to represent. He turned toward Emily, and the entire formation followed his gaze. Sergeant Carter, would you step forward? Emily hesitated for just a moment, the old instinct to remain in the background pulling at her. But Sanchez gave her a gentle nudge, and Voss offered a small, encouraging nod, and she stepped forward, standing before the entire assembled base for the first time since arriving, no longer invisible, no longer overlooked. Reynolds extended his hand, and when she took it, the applause that broke out across the compound wasn't the polite, obligatory kind that accompanies formal ceremonies. It was loud, sustained, genuine soldiers who 2 days earlier hadn't known her name, now standing and cheering for a woman who had, in the space of 72 hours, redefined what every single one of them thought they understood about courage, patience, and quiet strength. Sanchez watched from the crowd, feeling something swell in his chest that he didn't fully have words for, yet something between pride and gratitude, and the particular ache of watching someone finally receive what they deserved all along. Voss stood beside him, clapping harder than anyone. His earlier cruelty transformed into something that looked, for the first time since Sanchez had known him, like genuine, unguarded respect. You know, Voss said, leaning toward Sanchez, I've spent 11 years in this army trying to prove I belonged in it. Watching her up there, I think I finally understand what that actually looks like. Later that night, after the ceremony had wound down, and the base had settled into a quiet that felt fundamentally different from the tension of the previous 72 hours, Emily found herself once more on the eastern berm, the Barrett resting across her knees the way it had that very first morning. Except now the weight of it felt different, lighter somehow, carried by someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Reynolds found her there, approaching, slowly sitting down beside her without invitation, the way soldiers who've survived something together sometimes do. I have some news, he said. Colonel Delacroix reached out again, formally this time through proper channels. He's being reinstated as well, consulting on the broader investigation into how many other soldiers Briggs's methods may have affected over the years. Good, Emily said quietly. Nobody should have to carry what I carried alone for 3 years, wondering if the truth would ever matter to anyone. There's something else, Reynolds said. I've been offered a new assignment. Regional Command is restructuring several outposts, including this one, and they have asked me to take a broader oversight role, one that would give me influence over personnel decisions across multiple installations. Emily turned to look at him. Are you taking it? I am, Reynolds said, and I want you as part of my team's sergeant, not buried on some perimeter position where your talent gets overlooked by people who never bother to actually look. I want you training the next generation of marksmen, teaching them what you know, making sure nobody under your instruction ever has to spend 5 years being dismissed the way you were. Emily was quiet for a long moment, considering the offer, considering everything it represented, not just a promotion, not just recognition, but the chance to make sure her own painful history became something useful instead of something merely survived. I'd like that, she said finally, on one condition. Name it. Sanchez comes with us. He's got instincts most soldiers don't develop until years into their careers, and he stood beside me when it counted without hesitation, without knowing whether it would cost him anything. Reynolds smiled, the first genuinely relaxed expression Emily had seen from him since this entire ordeal began. Already planned on it, and for what it's worth, Voss requested a transfer to join the training program as well. Says he wants to spend the rest of his career making sure young soldiers learn to see people clearly instead of learning what he had to learn the hard way. Emily allowed herself a small, tired smile, looking out over the desert that had witnessed everything. The humiliation, the impossible shot, the firefight, the collapse of a 3-year cover-up, all of it unfolding across this same stretch of sand and sky that would tomorrow look exactly as unremarkable as it had the morning this all began. You know, she said quietly, I used to think being overlooked was just something I had to accept. Something that came with the kind of work I did, the kind of soldier I was. I told myself it didn't matter, that the job mattered more than being seen. And now I think the job always mattered, Emily said, but being seen matters too. Not for applause, not for medals, but because when people actually see you, truly see who you are and what you're capable of, they stop making the kind of assumptions that get people hurt, that let people like Briggs bury the truth for 3 years, that let a general walk past a soldier who could have saved his life 10 times over before he ever bothered to learn her name. Reynolds absorbed that in silence, the weight of it settling over him, with the particular clarity that comes only from nearly losing everything and being given against considerable odds a second chance to do better. I don't think I'll ever walk past another soldier without stopping again, he said quietly. Not after this. They sat together for a long while after that, the desert wind moving over them the way it had that very first morning, indifferent to rank, indifferent to history, the same wind that had carried a bullet nearly 4 kilometers to save a stranger's life, and had carried a voice across a frequency that officially didn't exist to finally set an old injustice right. In the weeks that followed, the story of Fort Raven Ridge and the soldier called Silent Falcon spread quietly through military circles, not as sensational headlines, but as something deeper. A case study taught in leadership courses about the danger of assumption, about the cost of overlooking the people standing quietly at the edges of every room, doing extraordinary work without ever asking for a single moment of recognition. Briggs's court-martial proceedings began that autumn, and Emily testified calm and precise, the same way she had approached every impossible shot in her career, laying out the truth without embellishment, without theatrics, simply the facts exactly as they had happened, and letting the weight of documented evidence carry the case the rest of the way. General Harold Briggs was ultimately convicted on charges including falsification of military records, dereliction of duty, and conspiracy connected to the authorized attack against Fort Raven Ridge, stripped of his rank and sentenced to federal prison, his 3 decades of service, ending not with the honors he'd spent a career protecting, but with the accountability he'd spent 3 years trying to escape. Colonel Delacroix's broader investigation uncovered 2 additional soldiers whose careers had been quietly buried under similar circumstances, both reinstated with full honors, both in time finding their own way back to the kind of recognition Emily had fought so hard to reclaim. And at a newly designated training facility nestled just outside Regional Command Headquarters, Sergeant First Class Emily Carter, promoted twice within the span of a single year, stood before a new class of young marksmen, watching them nervously check their equipment, the way she once had alone on a quiet berm nobody bothered to notice. Listen closely. She told them, her voice carrying the calm, unshakable authority that had once cut through chaos and impossible wind to save a base that never saw her coming. Somewhere out there, in a conflict you can't yet imagine, there's going to be a moment when everyone around you says something can't be done, when the wind won't cooperate, when the distance feels impossible, when every calculation says you should fail. I'm not here to teach you how to make an easy shot. I'm here to teach you how to make the shot nobody else believes is possible, because someday somebody's life is going to depend on exactly that. Master Sergeant Marcus Sanchez stood beside her. No longer the nervous young soldier who'd once fumbled with the spotting scope, but a steady, capable instructor in his own right, and Master Sergeant Derek Voss stood on her other side, a man who had learned at considerable personal cost that the soldiers worth respecting most are often the ones who never ask for it. Behind them, framed on the training facility's entrance wall, hung a single photograph, Emily Carter, standing on the eastern berm at Fort Raven Ridge, Barrett M82 resting across her shoulder, taken the very afternoon she'd made the impossible shot that changed everything, and beneath it, a simple engraved plaque that read in words General Michael Reynolds had chosen himself to every soldier standing quietly at the edges, waiting to be seen. Remember that the ones who need no applause are often the ones who deserve it most. And so the story of the soldier nobody noticed became the story every soldier who trained under her would carry for the rest of their careers, not as legend, not as exaggeration, but as unshakable documented truth. Proof that patience, quiet competence, and unwavering integrity will always eventually rise to meet the moment that demands them, no matter how long the world takes to finally look up and see what was standing right there in front of it all along.